Dear students, in this module, let us continue with our ongoing chapter, Chapter 7 of Biology, Control and Coordination. In this module, we'll be discussing about the movement or actions. Specific change in the environment evokes an appropriate response in the form of movement or action in living organisms. The actions could be basically of three types. That is, reflex action, which we will be studying in detail, the involuntary and the voluntary action. The involuntary actions are the ones which are not under our control or our will, whereas the voluntary actions are the ones which are under our control or our will. Talking about the reflex actions, they were discovered by Marshall Hall in 1833. These are nerve-mediated, automatic, involuntary actions that occur without the will of an animal. Thus, a reflex action can be defined as a spontaneous, automatic, mechanical response to a stimulus which is received from the external surroundings. So that's an external impetus. The example of the reflex actions are removal of our hand or withdrawal of our hand when we touch a hot object, blinking of eyes, movement of diaphragm during respiration is an example of reflex action. Coughing, yawning, sneezing are all reflex actions. Watering of mouth on seeing the food when hungry is also an example of reflex action. In case of reflex action, the stimulus activates the receptors and the sensory neuron carry the signals to the spinal cord. From the spinal cord, the message is brought back by the motor neuron with the help of motor neuron to the effector that could be a muscle or it could be a gland. Here in case of withdrawal of hand, the effector is the muscle. As can be seen in the diagrammatic representation over here is the pathway followed by the reflex action where when a pin is pricked, the signaling, the pain is felt by the sense organs. The sensory neuron carries the electrical impulse to the spinal cord and the signal is brought back with the help of motor neuron and it produces the effect on the effector, that is the muscle. So we'll remove our hand if it is pricked on our hand. Moving on to the next, that is here the PNS that stands for peripheral nervous system and CNS for the central nervous system. Let us talk about the reflex arc. The path taken by the nerve impulse in reflex action is called as a reflex arc. It basically comprises of 5 parts, that is the receptor which perceives or receives the stimulus, the sensory neuron or the efferent nerve which carries the signal to the spinal cord. Next is the portion of the central nervous system, that is the spinal cord, which analyzes and interprets the impulse. Motor neuron, it carries the impulse from the CNS to the effector. And finally, the effector that could be a muscle or a gland where the impulse terminates and the response occurs as per the instructions which are received from the central nervous system. Here is the detailed diagrammatic representation of a reflex arc wherein a receptor is a specific group of cell or organ, the neurons of which will receive the stimulus and that will set up a sensory impulse. Next is the efferent nerve, that is the sensory neuron, which will carry the impulse from the receptor to the CNS. Over here, it is the spinal cord. The spinal cord or the brain that forms a part of the CNS. Here, in case of reflex arc, the signal moves to the spinal cord so that the action could be taken up quickly. Next is the motor neuron or the efferent nerve. It carries the impulses from the CNS to the specific effector, which could be a muscle or it could be a gland. Next is the effector, which is wherein the impulse terminates and the response is generated as per the instructions perceived from the central nervous system. Talking about the reflex action, like here it can be seen, the one depicted in blue is the sensory neuron, which is carrying the signal, the one which is carrying the signal to the brain. The red is the motor neuron, which is getting back the signal to the effector, which could be a muscle. Here in this diagrammatic representation, it is a quadricep muscle. And the relay or the interneurons. So when we talk about the diagrammatic representation, it depicts the path which is followed by the nerve impulse. The reflex arc is the pathway which is followed by a reflex action when a nerve impulse or a nerve impulse. In reflex arc, the stimulus is received by the receptors, which are the basic sense organs, the 5 sense organs: eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and skin. The signaling is carried by the sensory nerves to the spinal cord. From the spinal cord, the signal is brought back by the motor nerves and the signaling is carried to the effector so as to generate a legitimate response. The significance of reflex action is it checks overloading and overtaxing of brain. It results in quick response to otherwise harmful stimuli without processing done by coordinating centers of CNS. It has a survival value. Talking about the involuntary action, they are without the will of the animal. For example, regular beating of heart, blood pressure, salivation, vomiting, movement of diaphragm, the pumping of blood are few examples of involuntary action. Voluntary muscular actions are performed by animal with its will. Like few instances can be cited as on seeing a snake in the way, one may run away on first occasion or call for help on second occasion or try to kill it to save himself or herself on the third occasion. All such actions are voluntary actions that are controlled by the hindbrain. Similarly, walking in a straight line, riding a bicycle, picking up a pencil are examples of voluntary actions controlled by the hindbrain. In this module, we carried out a detailed discussion on reflex, involuntary and voluntary action. In the next module, we'll be discussing about the central nervous system in detail. Thank you.